Tech Tips are brought to you by S&S, proven performance for the power sports industry.
With Chris's build well underway, let's check in with the team over at Klock Werks and see how the frame and engine are coming along.
So now that we got this area addressed and smoothed out, we're going to hack off these little frame horn things and smooth this all out because we won't be using these, so no point of having them up. What are we doing?
We're fabbing, and it's fabulous.
It's a fabulous day. So we got this cool oil tank from Jeff Cochran and
Speed King.
Yeah, Speed Kings, the original Speed Kings. And now we just gotta weld some tabs and get it mounted in.
What's up, everybody? Ryan here with Klock Werks. In front of you sits an S&S Panhead. So, a little bit of backstory on this. We're gonna do a cool thing where we're gonna be part of an S&S. What would you call it, Chris?
What would it be? Isn't it an invited builder?
Invited builder build-off, if you will. And so the man behind the camera, Chris Callan, he's doing a panhead. And Brian, he's doing a panhead. Well, we thought we'd make it kind of fun, right? Because as you guys know, Cycle Source is here with us in Mitchell. And why not do a teams thing? So Danny worked with Chris yesterday, tore their motor down. I'm gonna work with this one. We're gonna tear this one down. Both of them are gonna be complete opposites. You guys won't even believe what these two guys are doing. But they're both gonna be very unique in their own way. So let's jump into it. We are tearing this down because Brian, for one, as you guys know, is all about timeless design. Well, to achieve timeless design, you got to do things a certain way and, you know, add your own little flair to it, if you will. So what we're going to do is we're going to tear this motor down all the way to the bare case. We're then going to send it off, and it's going to be full polish. So by the time you guys see this motor back in action again, it's going to be fully polished. I don't know if, I'm sure there's other polished panheads out there, but there won't be one out there like this one. I can tell you that. Just to see the evolution of how the first early motors, right? Like let's say the Knucklehead, right? Which was really like a stepping stone of Harley. If you guys have ever been to the museum and you saw that motor wall, if you haven't been, definitely go take a look. It's in Milwaukee, it's awesome. But just to see how times have changed and the design of everything and really being able to tear into this gives you a whole new respect for evolution of technology, because this is considerably different than an Evo, even more different than a Milwaukee 8. You know what I mean? So just thinking of stuff like that, it's pretty wild.
Basic construction, it's still pretty similar, right?
Mm-hmm. So we got rid of the heat sink here.
Mm-hmm.
We've beefed up the rocker blocks here. Got rid of this heat sink here.
Yeah, and I imagine
then,
that
like
did a
you
lot
said-
for flow too, right?
Yep. Now, I wonder on the bottom side. So we're still pretty similar in terms
Kinda
of
surprising,
the
right?
combustion chamber. Obviously, this is S&S, so this is more performance driven.
But overall,
Overall,
the
it's,
chamber isn't that different. And I mean, for a 93-inch motor, there of course there's larger valves, but it's not like
yeah,
thing that's nice. And we talked about this last night. This is exotic machine work has been done to this, right?
Okay.
These inserts were pressed in. They were indexed to go below the gasket area. All that's already done on these, you know. So these are going to be lifetime fixtures.
okay. Interesting.
Now here's something funny. Looking at these two things, I told you the way these worked,
Yeah,
and I mean it's pretty cool, and they last for, you know, a long time this way too. But you know, inherently, this is always the failure point,
sure.
and a total pain in the ass now that we're talking about 60, 70 years later.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? Actually finding these or finding replacement ones.
And so, would you say that those original brass, what would you say the danger operating range was? Was that 4,000? Was it like
I don't know so much if it was a range as much as it was like you were never really going to make this into a 93-inch motor.
Sure.
You know what I mean? You were never going to put that much pressure on this. That's why you saw back in the early 2000s, Barry Wardlaw came up with that Panzer motor. This was the first thing that he addressed in that. This is probably, I don't want to sound dumb for saying this. This is probably based off of what Barry did with the Panzer motor back then to update the top end of a Panhead.
Sure.
But this is, from a mechanic standpoint, this is one of the things I wanted to show you. I was telling Danny about this last night. So to encourage oil to go to the push rods, I'm sorry, the push rod. No, I had that right. To the top of the valve. They had this little device here. Now the idea was oil would pump up, it would squirt on the roof of the valve cover, right? And they had a little mat there, like a fiber mat that would hold that oil.
Oh, and then
it would drip down,
Yep.
right? Well, their idea, and we can't figure out if this was an upgrade from the factory, but their idea was that oil would drip down on top of here, and they expected it to go along this rail and down into this little tube where it would come out and squirt where the rocker arm met the valve.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, and so obviously, as you can see, how much time has changed, you know.
Oh my God.
So we went to a roller, right? So we're not only reducing frictional wear, but overall mechanical wear here.
Because there we're just going with hardened steel, you know.
Yeah. And then obviously I can't imagine, okay.
Still.
So we're still pretty much the same.
Yep.
On the push rod side.
But just the way they thought about oil delivery and everything. I mean, when we get to the bottom end, you can talk about how the early Panheads actually had an oil trough that went from, you know, it would come back down the cylinder wall and then around the outside of the cylinder in the case journal. They would actually have this trough made that went around the cylinder and back into the case. You know what I mean? Like, it's ridiculous to think about how they would think of oil passages and, you know, how to transfer that cooling fluid.
Now, so the other interesting thing is with this is so you have this oiler here, and when we flip this over, obviously you can see where your oil would be fed through the push rod, right? But what you don't see is you don't see your exhaust port from the oil feed over to...
Well, the most important thing here was getting oil through that rod into this body to keep this cool, to try to keep that from coming apart.
So we're doing virtually the same thing with the new style, but to show you how technology's changed, through the push rod is the intake of oil, through the rocker arm assembly, but now when we have moved up to this roller bearing, right, we now have an exhaust port for the oil over here to actually lubricate that roller, the bearing, and
I just realized this.
The valve stem.
See that other hole?
Yep.
So they're guaranteeing that oil is going to be delivered along this rail with that hole. Because it's going to go on the body of this, whichever way it is. I don't have it right, but it's going to come off of the body of that and bleed down to that rail.
Very cool. today we have something really special for you. And that is we are working on an S&S Panhead motor. Not just any S&S Panhead motor, but a polished S&S Panhead motor. And what I mean by that is when we first got this motor from S&S, when we took it out the box, it looked pretty good to what a factory Panhead would look like with the texturing and everything like that. But that's not our style. We like to go up over the top, and you know, our motto is timeless design. So we took this down to bare cases, and we sent it down to our friend Steve at Elite Polishing, who really did a nice job on this motor. And today we are going to be going back together with the bottom end because we are still waiting for a Morris magneto. With that being said, to assemble this motor, we have to have the magneto in before we go up with the front cylinder. So what we wanted to expand on here just a little bit is in Harley-Davidson's evolution, we had the knucklehead, we had the panhead, shovelhead, evolution, twin cam, now we're on to M8. Well, in S&S's vintage line, they have 3 different motors. They have the S series, the P series, and the K series. So with this S&S build, there are 2 builders that are doing a K series, which is a knucklehead. They have 2 builders that are doing an S series, which is a shovelhead. And then you have the P series, 2 builders doing the P series, that's a panhead. And that happens to be right here at Klock Werks. One of them we have, the other one Chris Callan from Cyclosource has. Want to go over just a few different things that we talked about with Scott from S&S. So one of the biggest things about this panhead is the original Harley-Davidson panhead, when it was developed and was on the market, their oiling system. So their oiling system fed the pinion first, then went to the tappets. So what Scott had told us was, back in those days, your cam option was very limited. The oiling wasn't as good as it could have been, because for their oil pump assembly that they had developed, it was 5-to-1 ratio, which is 5 revolutions of this motor to pump that oil pump 1 time throughout the motor. So that's not really a whole lot of oiling. And the other thing that we found out was a lot of the time you would actually suffer from lack of oil to the tappets, and that's where you would get that loud rattle, and then it would start working its way up through the push rods into your rocker arms and just wearing everything out. Lack of lubrication. So what S&S has done is they have redeveloped and redesigned the oiling system. So now it actually feeds the tappets first to make sure that we have proper oiling, proper flow, proper pressure. And then secondary to the tappets, it feeds the pinion. The other thing that they did is they re-engineered the oil pump. So now it is not a 5-to-1 ratio, it's actually 4-to-1. So we are not only getting better flow, but we're getting better all lubrication, starting from the pump, feeding the engine, and then returning to the pump with a 4-to-1 ratio. So now the engine only has to spin 4 times to complete that circuit. This is a 93-inch panhead. So with that being said, this is a 4.5-inch stroke with a 3 5/8 bore. We're setting the flywheel into the case. We ran into a few issues in terms of pressing the flywheel into the case. We did not have the specialty tool that has been made for that. But thanks to Chris Callan from CycleSource and his infinite knowledge, we made our own pulling tool. This is just 1.5" DOM tubing, and we made a 3/4, a 1 inch, and an 1 3/8 spacer. We utilized the washer and a nut, and we were able to get this flywheel pressed into the case, no issues, and now we are ready to seal these 2 case halves. So we'll start by grabbing our silicone, and what we want to do is we want to seal both of these sides up. If we get some on the outside of the case, we can always clean that up when we're done. We just want to make sure that we get this thing sealed up good. Rear cylinder kind of came down. We're going to go through the cam chest and we're going to come back up on the front cylinder. Reason behind that is we are deciding to take the factory style ignition out, and we are actually using a Morris magneto. Well, with that being said, that magneto is still about a week and a half out, but I got to have this motor together so that we can fit it up in the chassis so that we can verify clearance on everything, if Shelton has to do any other fabrication, stuff like that. All right, folks, it is time for the cam cover. So just to review, we have the rear completely assembled, all Loctited down and everything. The front, we have 1 head bolt in because the head has to come back off. We have 4 bolts in the cover. We have the push rod tubes in, no push rods, just to seal up the motor so that nothing gets inside. We have our cams timed and everything. We're only going to be putting 4 bolts into the cam cover because that too will have to come back off for the installation of the magneto. But we are pretty much fully done. So with that being said, we're just going to go ahead and mock this up.